The lawyer read the will in a voice too flat for what it carried, and Margaret Coyle sat very still, while her sisters exchanged a look across the table, the kind of look that had followed her since childhood. To them, the flower shop was a joke dressed up as an inheritance, a crumbling greenhouse and a name nobody in the family wanted. They took the houses. They took the accounts. They let her have the dirt. Larkspur Hollow had not changed its shape in 60 years, only its color, fading the way old photographs do, and the shop at the end of Route 9 sat behind its dead hedges like something the town had agreed to stop seeing, paint peeled from the sign in long curling strips. The glass panes of the greenhouse had gone the color of weak tea. And somewhere beneath all that abandonment, an old woman had left one instruction that made no sense to anyone but her. Vera Coyle had spent her final years alone, careful and quiet in a way people mistook for bitterness. She kept ledgers no one read. She locked doors that led nowhere important, or so it seemed. She said little and forgave less, and the town had long since decided it understood her completely, which was its first mistake. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a place built to hide something. A silence with weight to it, and it was waiting in that greenhouse the day Margaret finally turned the key. Somewhere beneath the raised beds and the rotted floor slats, beneath 40 years of dust and disregard, something had been sealed away on purpose by hands that knew exactly what they were protecting. Her sisters would come back for that shop once they understood what it was truly worth, and they would not come back kindly. But by then, Margaret would already know what her aunt had spent a lifetime building in secret, one quiet act at a time, and what it meant to be the only one Vera Coyle had ever trusted enough to leave it to. The office of Delmore and Associates smelled of toner and old carpet, and the radiator under the window ticked every few seconds like it was counting down to something. Margaret Coyle sat in the middle chair, the one nobody wanted, flanked by her sisters on either side. Renata had crossed her legs and checked her watch twice already. Denise kept her purse in her lap, both hands on the clasp, like she expected the meeting to run long and wanted to be ready to leave the second it did. Nobody had spoken since they'd sat down. The lawyer, a heavy-set man named Harold Pruitt, with reading glasses pushed low on his nose, cleared his throat and began working through the estate of Vera Coyle, line by line, in the flat, careful voice of a man who had done this 1,000 times and stopped feeling anything about it long ago. The house on Birchwood Lane went to Renata, along with the account that held $61,400. Most of it from a life insurance policy Vera had paid into for 30 years without ever mentioning it to anyone. Denise received the rental property on 4th Street and a separate account worth $29,000, plus Vera's car, a 1991 Buick that hadn't run in 4 years. Harold read each line without inflection, the numbers landing in the quiet room like stones dropped into still water. Renata nodded along, already doing math behind her eyes. Denise exhaled slow through her nose, the closest thing to a smile she allowed herself in front of her sisters. Then Harold turned a page, and his eyes moved to Margaret. To Margaret Elaine Coyle, he read, I leave the flower shop and greenhouse property at 412 Larkspur Road, together with all fixtures, tools, and inventory contained therein. Renata's mouth twitched at the corner. Denise looked down at her purse and said nothing, which from Denise was its own kind of statement. Margaret kept her hands folded in her lap and did not look at either of them. She had expected this, or something close to it. Vera had never pretended to think of her the way she thought of the other two, not out loud, not in the family gatherings that had grown thinner and shorter over the years. Harold kept reading. There was a debt on the shop, $7,200 owed to the county for back taxes, and a separate note that the building's roof had been cited twice for code violations that were never repaired. He said this the way he said everything, without comment. but he paused a half-second before the next line, long enough that Margaret noticed it, though she couldn't have said why. Renata didn't wait for the pause to matter. She let out a short laugh, more breath than sound, and reached for her purse. "Well," she said, "at least you won't have to worry about competing with us for parking." Denise didn't laugh, but she didn't stop it either. She looked at Margaret with something that might have been pity, might have been relief that it hadn't landed on her. Margaret said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence cost her sisters more than an answer ever would, because it gave them nothing to push against. Harold shuffled the papers and glanced up over his glasses. And this time, there was something in his face that hadn't been there for the first 2/3 of the reading. "There is one additional provision," he said, attached specifically to the greenhouse. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something he does not fully understand himself. "The greenhouse floor and the ground beneath it are not to be sold, altered, or excavated by any party other than Margaret Elaine Coyle, for a period of no less than 10 years from the date of this will, under penalty of forfeiture of the entire property to the Larkspur County Historical Trust." The radiator ticked. Nobody spoke for a moment. Renata frowned, the kind of frown that meant she was recalculating something. "Why would she put that in?" she said, more to the room than to anyone in it. "It's a greenhouse floor." Harold folded his hands over the papers and said he couldn't speak to Vera's reasoning, only to the language of the document, which was, in his professional opinion, unusually specific for a woman who had otherwise kept her estate simple. He said this last part carefully, like it was a small warning he wasn't quite authorized to give. Denise asked if there was money attached to the provision, some fund for upkeep, and Harold said no, nothing beyond what had already been listed. Just the restriction. Just the floor. Margaret found herself thinking, unbidden, about the last time she'd stood in that greenhouse 9 years old, watching her aunt press seedlings into black soil with 2 bare thumbs, saying nothing about what she was planting, only that it would come up when it was ready, and not a day before. Vera had never explained herself to children, and apparently she hadn't planned to start explaining herself in death either. Renata was already talking about contesting the provision, using words like unenforceable and pointless, the kind of words that came easily to her because she'd spent 15 years managing property and believed, correctly most of the time, that most restrictions could be negotiated away. Denise didn't argue with her, but she didn't agree either. She just watched Margaret. Quiet, the purse clasp clicking open and shut once under her thumb. Harold closed the folder and said the paperwork for transfer would take approximately 3 weeks, and that Margaret would need to come by his office on the 14th to sign the final documents and collect the keys. 3 weeks, he said again, as if the number itself might need repeating for it to be believed. Renata stood first, smoothing her skirt, already reaching for her phone. Denise stood second, slower, and for a moment she looked at Margaret like she might say something real. She didn't. She picked up her purse and followed her sister out, and the door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed too gentle for what had just happened in that room. Margaret stayed seated a moment longer than she needed to. Harold slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward her, a copy of the provision, the one about the floor, and he tapped it once with 2 fingers before letting go. Whatever she was protecting down there, he said, she wanted it protected for a long time. He didn't smile when he said it. Margaret folded the paper along its existing crease and put it in her coat pocket and outside the window. The parking lot lights buzzed on early, against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was evening or not. 3 weeks later, on the morning of the 14th, Margaret signed the last of the transfer documents in Harold Pruitt's office and left with a manila envelope holding 2 keys, a folded deed, and a business card for a county tax office she'd already decided to call on Monday. The drive back to Larkspur Hollow took just under an hour, and she spent most of it with the radio off, watching the highway narrow into a 2-lane county road the way it always did once you left the interstate behind. Billboards gave way to fence posts. Fence posts gave way to fields gone gold with late-season grass. By the time she crossed the bridge over Miller's Creek, the pavement had gone rough and patched, and she found herself slowing down without deciding to, the way she always did on this stretch, as if the road itself remembered how long she'd been gone. She had not been back to Larkspur Hollow in almost 4 years, not since her mother's funeral. And even then she had stayed only 2 days before driving back to the city and the apartment and the job at the insurance office that paid well enough and asked nothing interesting of her. Vera had not come to that funeral. Word at the time was that she'd had a fall, a hip that never set quite right, and that the drive was too much for her. Margaret had believed it then. She wondered now, turning onto County Road 11, whether that had been the whole truth or only the part Vera wanted told. Because Vera had always kept a careful distance between what she said and what she meant, and nobody in the family had ever quite closed that gap. The nursing home records had come to Margaret almost by accident, forwarded from Harold's office along with a stack of paperwork she was supposed to file with the county. Fairview Manor, the letterhead read, and the account showed 11 months of care before Vera passed, paid for out of an account nobody in the family had known existed until the will was read. $2,100 a month, deducted like clockwork, with a note in the margin from an aide who had apparently liked her. Mrs. Coyle keeps to herself, but always asks after the greenhouse. Margaret had read that line 3 times in the parking lot outside Harold's office before folding the paper away. It was such a small thing. It stayed with her anyway. Vera had been the kind of woman people in Larkspur Hollow described using the word particular, which Margaret had come to understand over the years as a polite way of saying difficult. She ran the flower shop alone for 40 years, opened at 7 and closed at 5. Took no help. She hadn't personally trained and was known to turn away customers who tried to negotiate on price. She never remarried after her husband died young, never moved from the small house behind the shop, and never explained to anyone why she kept the greenhouse running, even in the years when the flower business itself had clearly stopped making money. People had theories. Nobody had ever asked her outright, because Vera had a way of ending conversations before they became questions. The last stretch of road into town ran past the old grain elevator, the one that hadn't operated since Margaret was in high school, and then past the church. And then the road itself changed under the tires, asphalt giving way to a patchwork of gravel and packed dirt where the county had apparently stopped maintaining it. Sometime in the last decade. Margaret's car bounced through a pothole hard enough to rattle the glove box open, and she reached over without looking to push it shut. Emotion so old and automatic it startled her a little. Muscle memory from a childhood spent riding this exact road in the passenger seat of her grandfather's truck. The trees closed in tighter here, oak and sycamore leaning over the road from both sides, and the light went dim and green and close, the way it always did on Larkspur Road no matter the time of day. She passed the old fire station, boarded now, and the Hendricks place with its collapsed porch, and then the road bent left one final time and the shop came into view, sitting exactly where it had always sat, exactly as tired as she'd expected it to be. The sign out front, hand-painted decades ago to read Coyle's Flowers and Greenery, had faded to the point where the letters looked more like suggestions than words. The parking apron was cracked through in a dozen places, weeds pushing up through the gaps in dark green fists. The front windows were fogged with dust on the inside, the kind of dust that only settles when nobody's been in to clean for a very long time. Margaret sat in the car a moment with the engine off, looking at it, feeling less like she was arriving somewhere and more like she was being shown something she already knew. She got out slowly, envelope in hand, and walked the cracked apron toward the front door, taking in the details one at a time, the way she supposed a person did when they were trying to delay something. The gutters sagged on the east side, pulling away from the roofline. A wind chime, tarnished green, hung motionless from a bracket by the door, its clapper missing. Someone had once painted the trim a cheerful yellow, and it had faded now to the color of old butter, peeling in long curls along the window frames. She found the right key on the second try, the metal stiff in the lock, and pushed the door open against a year's worth of settled dust and the particular stale sweetness of a room that had once been full of flowers and hadn't been for a long time. Inside, the shop was smaller than she remembered, the way places from childhood always are. The counter still holding an ancient cash register with a hand crank on the side. Drawers behind it stacked with ribbon spools gone brittle and curled. A calendar on the wall was still turned to a month from over a year ago, the pages beneath it untouched, as though time in that particular corner of the building had simply stopped keeping track. Margaret ran a hand along the counter, and it came away gray with dust. She thought, not for the first time since the reading of the will, that her sisters had gotten the better end of this by any reasonable measure, and that Vera had known it perfectly well when she wrote the provision about the floor, because a woman that particular did not attach conditions to things she considered worthless. Margaret left the counter and its curled ribbon spools and walked toward the back of the shop, where a narrow hallway led past a small office and out through a door that had once been propped open every morning from March to October. The hallway smelled of dust and old paper, and a coat still hung on a hook by the office door. A woman's canvas work coat, faded green, with a name tag stitched crooked above the pocket that read V. Coyle. Margaret didn't touch it. She stood in front of it for a moment, the way a person stands in front of something they aren't ready to decide about, then continued down the hall toward the back exit, her footsteps loud on the old plank floor in a building that had otherwise gone completely silent. The back door stuck in its frame, swollen from years of damp, and she had to put a shoulder into it before it gave way and let her out into the small fenced yard between the shop and the greenhouse. The greenhouse itself sat maybe 30 feet back, a long, low structure of white-painted steel framing and glass panels, most of them fogged over with grime, a few cracked outright and patched with duct tape gone brittle and gray. Weeds had grown up thick along its foundation, waist-high in places, and the path leading to its door had all but disappeared under a season of unchecked growth. It looked, from where Margaret stood, exactly like every other neglected thing on the property. She started toward it anyway because that was the one place the will had bothered to mention by name. She pushed through the weeds, feeling the damp come up through her jeans, and stopped a few feet from the greenhouse door because something about it had caught her eye that hadn't matched the rest of the walk. The door itself was old, aluminum framed, its paint chipped down to bare metal in long streaks. But the padlock hanging from the hasp was not old. It was a brass master lock, the kind sold at any hardware store, and it had none of the pitting or corrosion that should have come from a year of exposure to weather. Someone had oiled the shackle recently enough that a thin film still caught the light. Margaret crouched down and looked at it more closely, turning it slightly in her hand without opening it, and found herself doing the math on how long it had actually been since anyone had walked into that building. Everything else on the property told the same story, a story of abandonment measured in years, not months. The gutters told it. The cracked parking apron told it. The dead calendar on the office wall told it plainest of all. But this lock told a different story entirely. One that didn't fit anywhere in the timeline Margaret had built in her head on the drive over. She thought of the aide's note from the nursing home file, the one about Vera always asking after the greenhouse, and she thought of the provision in the will, the one Harold had read slowly because even he hadn't fully understood it. She stood back up, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked at the building itself with new attention. The way you look at a person once you suspect they haven't told you everything. She didn't have a key for this particular lock. The 2 keys in her envelope opened the shop's front and back doors, nothing else. And Harold hadn't mentioned a third. Margaret walked the perimeter of the greenhouse instead, pushing through weeds and stepping over a coil of rotted garden hose, checking each glass panel for a way in that didn't require force. Most of the panels were sealed tight in their frames, old glazing compound gone hard as stone around the edges. Near the back corner, though, she found one pane that had been reset more recently than the others, the glazing around it still slightly pliable, a shade lighter than the weathered gray of everything surrounding it. It was a small thing. It was by now the second small thing. She stood there a long moment in the tall grass at the back of the building, arms crossed, working through what she actually knew. Vera had let the shop go. That much was plain from every angle. The dust and the dead calendar and the roof citations mentioned in the will. But somebody, and there was no reason yet to think it was anyone other than Vera herself, had maintained this greenhouse door and at least one section of this greenhouse wall with real care, and recently enough that oil hadn't dulled and glazing hadn't fully cured. It didn't square with a business gone under. It didn't square with an old woman spending her final year in a nursing home a county away either, unless someone else had been coming out here on her behalf, or unless Vera herself had been getting out here far more often than anyone in the family had assumed. Margaret walked back around to the front of the greenhouse and crouched again in front of the lock, turning it over once more, reading the tiny embossed lettering on its face as if it might tell her something useful. It didn't. She thought about driving into town to find a hardware store, or calling Harold to ask if there was a third key somewhere in Vera's effects that hadn't made it into the envelope. She thought about the shed she remembered from childhood, tucked behind the shop near the old delivery van that hadn't run in years, and whether there might be a bolt cutter in it or a hacksaw, something that could get her through a hasp if it came to that. The light was starting to lean gold and low across the weeds, the kind of late afternoon light that made even ruined things look briefly like something worth saving. She stood up, hands on her hips, and looked at the greenhouse hole, taking in its sagging roofline and its patched glass and its one door that refused to match anything else about the place. Somewhere behind that glass, benches she remembered from childhood were probably still standing, dry soil in their beds. Whatever Vera had last planted in them long since gone to seed or dust. The provision in the will came back to her then, word for word, the way Harold had read it slow and careful, about the floor and the ground beneath it, not to be sold or altered or excavated for 10 years. It was a greenhouse floor, Renata had said, more baffled than scornful. Standing there in the weeds with the light going gold and the new lock warm in her palm, Margaret was no longer so sure her sister had been right. The shed behind the shop was exactly where Margaret remembered it, leaning slightly on its foundation, its door held shut with a loop of baling wire instead of a proper latch. She twisted the wire loose and stepped inside, into a smell of gasoline and old rubber, and found what she was looking for hanging on a pegboard along the back wall, tools arranged with a precision that surprised her given the state of everything else on the property. A pair of bolt cutters hung on 2 bent nails, their red handles faded to pink, and beside them a flat pry bar, a claw hammer, and a coil of wire so neat it looked untouched. Margaret took the bolt cutters and the pry bar and left the rest, and walked back toward the greenhouse with the low sun throwing her shadow long across the weeds. The lock gave more easily than she expected, the bolt cutters snapping through the shackle with a single hard squeeze that jarred her wrists more than she'd braced for. The hasp swung free, and the door groaned open on hinges that hadn't turned in what looked like months, not years, which struck her again as strange given everything else. Inside, the air was warmer than outside, and thick with the smell of dry soil, and something faintly green underneath it, as if the building had kept some small memory of the plants it once held. Rows of wooden benches ran the length of the space, most of them holding pots gone to dust and brittle stalks. But the center aisle had been cleared entirely, the dirt floor there packed hard and smooth in a way the edges weren't. Margaret walked the cleared aisle slowly, boots crunching on packed earth, until she reached a section near the back where the ground gave slightly under her weight, a give that didn't belong in dirt this compacted. She crouched down and brushed at the surface with her palm, and beneath a thin layer of loose soil her fingers found wood, planed boards laid flat and fitted close, deliberately buried just beneath the dirt so that from a standing height they'd never be noticed. She sat back on her heels and stared at it a long moment. Then she went to work with the edge of the pry bar, scraping the covering soil away in careful strokes until 4 boards lay exposed, roughly 4 feet by 3. Their edges tight enough that she had to work the bar's flat tip into the seam by inches. The first board resisted for a long time, the wood swollen and the nails rusted fast into whatever framing sat beneath. Margaret braced one boot against the bench leg beside her and leaned her full weight onto the bar, feeling the muscles in her forearms burn. And the board finally groaned upward an inch, then 2, before a nail tore free with a shriek of old metal. She worked the gap wider, switching the bar's angle, sweat gathering at her hairline despite the cool evening air coming through the cracked panels overhead. Her palms had gone raw against the bar's handle by the time the first board came free entirely, and she set it aside and looked down into the narrow gap it left behind, where nothing was visible yet but darker soil and the edge of something rectangular wrapped in what looked like feed sack cloth. She kept going. The second board took less time than the first, the nails weaker now that the frame had shifted, and it came up with a single hard pull that sent her stumbling back a step onto the packed dirt. The third and fourth followed in quicker succession, each one loosening the next, until she had an opening roughly 2 feet square and the last of the daylight fading fast through the grimy glass overhead. She wiped her forehead on the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of dirt across her hairline, and reached down into the gap with both hands, feeling along the edges of the cloth-wrapped shape until her fingers found a corner she could grip. It came up heavier than she expected, a wooden box roughly the size of a bread loaf, its cloth wrapping gone soft and gray with age but intact, tied with a length of the same wax twine Vera had always used to bundle stems at the register. Margaret set it on the nearest bench and untied the twine with fingers that weren't quite steady, and the cloth fell away to reveal a small cedar box, its corners joined with careful dovetails, the wood darkened but otherwise sound. There was no lock on it, only a simple brass hasp, and Margaret stood over it a long moment before reaching for it, the same way she'd stood in front of the coat on the hook without touching it, giving herself a second she didn't quite need. She lifted the hasp, and it gave with a small, soft click, the kind of sound a thing makes when it has been waiting a long time to be opened by the right hands. Inside, folded flat, was a single sheet of paper, and beneath it a smaller bundle wrapped in the same waxed twine, and beneath that, nestled in a bed of cedar shavings, a ring of keys she didn't recognize, none of them matching the shop's front or back doors. She lifted the paper out first and unfolded it under the last gray light coming through the glass overhead. It was not the letter. It was too short for that, just a few lines in Vera's small, upright handwriting, dated 11 years back. The ink gone slightly brown with age. "If you have gotten this far," it read, "you did the work yourself, which is the only way I would have trusted anyone to find it. There is more than this. Ask Walt Pruitt before you ask anyone else. He knows which door and he will not ask you for money, and you are not to offer him any." Margaret read it twice, then a third time, her thumb resting on the fold where the paper had been creased for over a decade. She knew the name. Walt Pruitt had fixed the lock on her grandfather's tractor shed once, years ago, back when she was still young enough to be underfoot at every job like that, instead of 1,000 miles away building a life that had somehow never quite felt like her own. She sat down on the overturned bucket beside the bench, the cedar box open in her lap, the keys cool and unfamiliar against her palm, and looked around the greenhouse at the rows of dead plants and the hole she'd torn into its floor. Outside, the light had gone from gold to the deep blue of early evening, and somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Margaret closed the box carefully. The way you close something you already understand is not the end of the story, only the first door of several, and sat there a while longer before she found the strength to stand up and go looking for her phone to find Walt Pruitt's number. Walt Pruitt's number was still listed in the thin county phone book Margaret found in a kitchen drawer at Vera's house, wedged between a stack of seed catalogs and a rubber-banded bundle of rent receipts. She called from the kitchen table a little after 8, the cedar box sitting closed in front of her, and a man's voice answered on the 4th ring. Unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent a lot of years talking to machinery instead of people. She explained who she was, and there was a pause on the line long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up, before he said he'd known Vera Coyle a long time, and that he supposed it was about time somebody called him about the greenhouse. He arrived the next morning a little after 9, driving a pickup truck old enough that the paint had gone matte, and the tailgate was held shut with a bungee cord instead of a working latch. Walt Pruitt turned out to be a broad, stooped man in his 70s, wearing a canvas jacket with a locksmith's guild patch stitched crooked on one shoulder, and he walked the property slowly, taking in the greenhouse and the torn-up floor without much visible reaction, the way a man does when he's already seen the outline of something in his head and is only confirming the details. He crouched at the edge of the hole Margaret had made and looked at it a long moment, then looked at her and said, Vera had asked him twice over the years what he thought would happen if somebody eventually found this. Before we go further, if a story like this one keeps you company, consider subscribing so the next one finds you too. Walt didn't say much else at first. He walked back toward his truck and returned with a small canvas tool roll, worn soft at the folds, and from it he took a single brass key, old enough that its teeth had gone slightly rounded with use. He held it out to Margaret without ceremony, the way you'd hand someone a screwdriver, and said it fit the padlock on the old well house behind the property line, the one most people in town had forgotten was even there, tangled now in a stand of sumac that had grown up thick over the last decade. Margaret turned the key over in her palm and asked him what was in it, and Walt shrugged in a way that wasn't quite a dodge. More the shrug of a man who genuinely didn't know the whole of it and had never asked. Vera didn't tell people things unless they needed telling, he said. She told me to keep this key safe and to give it to whoever finally opened that greenhouse floor with their own 2 hands. Not before. He said it plainly, without drama, the kind of plain that made it land harder than if he'd tried to make it sound important. Margaret asked how long he'd been holding on to it. 11 years, he said, same as the note. Give or take. She offered him money before she could stop herself, an old reflex, the kind of thing you do when someone hands you something valuable and you don't know what else to offer in return. Walt held up one hand, flat, and shook his head once, firm. Vera never paid me for the small things, he said. And I'm not about to start collecting now that she's gone. He said it without heat, without the performance of humility some people wear when they refuse a kindness. Just a fact stated the way he'd state the size of a bolt or the pitch of a roof. Margaret folded the key into her palm and thanked him anyway, and he waved it off with the same hand he'd used to refuse the money. He stayed another 20 minutes, walking the greenhouse a second time, running a thumb along the warped hinge of the door until he found the spot where it bound. And then, without asking whether she wanted the help, he took a small can of oil from his tool roll and worked the hinge loose, back and forth, until it swung silent on its pin. Margaret watched him do it and didn't offer to pay for that either, because she understood by now that the offer itself would have been its own kind of insult. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a rag from his back pocket and looked at her steady, the way older men in that part of the country did when they were about to say something they considered important and didn't want repeated back to them wrong. Your aunt was not an easy woman, Walt said, but she was careful in a way most people mistake for cold. She kept track of things other people forgot. He didn't elaborate on what that meant, and Margaret didn't press him, sensing that whatever he knew belonged to Vera to explain, not to him. He told her the well house sat about 60 yards past the greenhouse along the old fence line, and that the sumac had probably swallowed the path entirely by now, but that the structure itself was sound enough, built the same year as the greenhouse and maintained, as far as he knew, on roughly the same schedule. He said this last part with a small, private note in his voice, as if he found something almost funny in it, though nothing about his face suggested humor. Before he left, Walt paused at the door of his truck and looked back at the greenhouse once more, at the torn floorboards and the cedar box still sitting on the workbench inside. He said Vera used to tell him that some things were worth doing quietly, and that the ones worth trusting were the ones who never asked to be thanked for it. He climbed into the truck without waiting for a response, and the engine turned over rough twice before catching, and he pulled away down the gravel drive with one hand raised out the window, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement that something had passed between them worth marking. Margaret stood in the yard a long while after the sound of his truck had faded into the trees, the old brass key warm now from her closed fist, looking past the greenhouse toward the tangled sumac line where, 60 yards off, something else of her aunt's was apparently still waiting to be found. Margaret found the machete in the same shed that had given up the bolt cutters hanging on its own nail beside a coil of trimmer line, and she carried it along with a flashlight out past the greenhouse toward the fence line Walt had described. The sumac had grown up in a dense wall taller than she was, red-stemmed and thick with the last green leaves of the season, and there was no path through it that she could see, only a faint depression in the grass at its base that might have been a trail once, years back, before the brush had reclaimed it entirely. She started cutting anyway, working the blade in short, controlled strokes the way her grandfather had taught her decades ago, and the sumac gave way slowly, stem by stem, filling the air with a sharp green smell that stung faintly at the back of her throat. It took nearly 40 minutes to cut 60 yards, longer than she expected, her shoulders burning and her shirt soaked through by the time the brush finally thinned and the well house came into view, a squat structure of the same white-painted steel framing as the greenhouse, its small door secured with a padlock that matched the one Walt had given her a key for. The roof had held up better than she'd feared, only a few panels showing rust, and the door itself swung on hinges that had clearly been oiled within the last year, same as the greenhouse door had been before Walt worked on it. Margaret fit the old brass key into the lock, and it turned with a resistance that gave way smoothly. The mechanism worn but sound, built to outlast the people who used it. Inside, the structure held no well at all, not anymore, if it ever truly had. A poured concrete floor took up most of the space, dry and swept clean, and against the back wall stood a metal filing cabinet, government surplus by the look of it, 4 drawers deep, secured with a simple slide bolt rather than a lock. Margaret played the flashlight beam across it, then across a second object beside it, a wooden trunk banded in iron. Its lid held shut with a hasp identical to the one on the cedar box from the greenhouse floor. She crouched in front of the trunk first, working the hasp loose with fingers that had gone stiff from the cold morning air, and lifted the lid slowly, the hinges giving one soft creak before settling open. The trunk held cash, more of it than Margaret had ever seen outside of a bank counter, bundled in rubber bands and organized by denomination, 20s and 50s mostly, with a smaller stack of hundreds near the bottom. She didn't count it there in the half-dark of the well house, but a quick guess put it well past $10,000, and when she later sat down at Vera's kitchen table and counted it properly twice, it came to $18,200 exactly, banded and dated in Vera's small handwriting on strips of paper, tucked between the bundles. The earliest dated 14 years back and the most recent dated less than a year before her death. Beneath the cash sat a stack of property deeds, 6 of them, each for a small house or lot within Larkspur Hollow, each one showing Vera Coyle as the purchaser, each one purchased for a fraction of what the property would have been worth on the open market. Margaret sat back on her heels and stared at the deeds for a long moment before turning to the filing cabinet, sliding the bolt free and pulling open the top drawer to find it packed with ledgers, dozens of them. Thin composition notebooks with dates written on their covers in Vera's careful hand, going back nearly 30 years. She pulled the earliest one and opened it under the flashlight beam, and found columns of names and numbers, small amounts mostly. $10 here, $40 there, the occasional larger sum, each one paired with a brief note in the margin. Behind on rent, one line read, "School shoes, 3 children," read another. "Roof repair, Hendricks Place," read a third. Dated the same year Margaret remembered the Hendricks family losing their barn to a storm, a family she'd gone to school with and had lost track of entirely once she left for the city. She worked through the ledgers for the better part of an hour, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor with the flashlight propped against the trunk. And the picture that emerged was not the picture of a woman who had simply let a flower shop fail out of neglect. It was the picture of a woman who had spent 30 years quietly redirecting nearly everything the shop and the greenhouse ever earned into the hands of people in Larkspur Hollow who needed it and would never have accepted it if she'd offered it with her name attached. Mortgages paid down anonymously through a third party. Medical bills settled in cash, hand-delivered, no note. A young man's community college tuition covered in full for 2 years running, the ledger noting only his initials and the words "Good boy. Works hard." Vera Coyle, particular and difficult and closed off, had apparently spent 3 decades being the quietest kind of generous a small town could produce. Margaret closed the last ledger and sat there a long while in the cold, listening to the wind move through what remained of the sumac outside, thinking about the $61,400 her sister Renata had inherited without a second thought, and the $29,000 Denise had gotten along with a car that didn't run, and the flower shop and greenhouse that both of them had considered the lesser prize. She thought about the note in the cedar box, the one that said there was more than this, and understood now that Vera had not been exaggerating, and had not been sentimental about it either, only precise the way she was precise about everything. The real inheritance had never been the building at all. It had been sitting here in a filing cabinet behind a fence line nobody had bothered to clear in years, waiting for someone willing to do the work of finding it. She gathered what she could carry back to the house that afternoon, the trunk too heavy to move alone. The ledgers stacked carefully in a cardboard box she found in the shed. And as she made the trip back and forth along the path she'd cut through the sumac, she found herself thinking less about the money and more about the names in those margins. People she'd grown up beside. People whose quiet good fortune over the years she had never once connected to the woman running the failing flower shop at the end of Larkspur Road. By the time the light went gold and long across the yard again, Margaret had made 3 trips, her arms aching, her shirt streaked with dust and rust, and she stood at the kitchen table looking down at the ledgers stacked in careful rows, understanding for the first time exactly what her aunt had spent a lifetime building, and exactly why she'd been so unwilling to let anyone find it before they'd earned the right to. It was near midnight before Margaret found the envelope, tucked into the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet beneath the last of the ledgers, sealed with wax the color of dried blood and addressed in Vera's small upright hand to simply Margaret. She had gone back out to the well house alone after supper, unable to leave the cabinet only half searched, and she carried the envelope back to the kitchen table under one arm, the way a person carries something they suspect will change the shape of an evening. She set it down in front of her, made a cup of tea she didn't really want, and sat with it a long while before finally sliding a knife under the wax seal and drawing out 3 folded sheets of paper, covered edge to edge in the same careful handwriting as the ledgers. She smoothed the pages flat on the table under the kitchen light and began to read. And the voice that rose up off the paper was Vera's voice exactly, plain and unhurried. The same voice that used to tell her seedlings would come up when they were ready, and not a day before. Margaret, the letter began. If you are reading this, you did what I hoped you would do, and nothing I could have made you do, which is the only kind of trust worth having in a person. I am writing this on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 11 years before whatever day you are reading it, sitting at this same table with tea gone cold, same as yours probably has by now. I will try to say this plainly, because I never had much patience for people who dress things up. You will have found the money by now, and the deeds and the ledgers, and I imagine you have spent an evening or two feeling foolish for every year you assumed I had simply let the shop run itself into the ground. I did let it run down, some. I was never much of a businesswoman, and Flowers stopped paying the bills the way they used to sometime around when your mother was still a girl. But the shop paid for something else entirely, something I never once explained to your mother, or your Aunt Ruth, or anyone in this family. Because explaining it would have meant asking people to keep a secret, and I have never trusted a Coyle to keep one, present company being the one exception I am gambling on now. There is a boy named Everett Hale who lives 2 streets over from the church, or he did the last I knew of it, and his mother could not have kept that house without help. Nobody was willing to trace back to me. There is a woman, Carol Whitfield, who buried a husband too young and would have lost the diner along with him if a certain debt hadn't quietly disappeared from the county records. There are others, more than I could name in 3 pages, and you will find most of them in those ledgers if you read close enough, though I was careful never to write down more than I needed to remember who and how much and never why, because the why was always the same and did not need repeating. People fall down. Somebody ought to help them up without making a show of it. I started small, Margaret, smaller than you would believe. $40 here and 20 there. Back when I was still young enough to think I would grow the shop into something big enough to matter on its own. It never grew that way. What it did instead was teach me that a flower shop in a town like this one does not need to be profitable to be useful. It only needs to keep its doors open long enough for people to walk past it and think nothing much of the woman inside, which gave me more room to move than any amount of money ever could have. Nobody watches a woman selling carnations for 40 years. That was never an accident. I built it that way on purpose, one quiet year at a time. And I would build it the same way again if I had to start over tomorrow. I chose you for the greenhouse floor because you were the one who left, and because leaving the way you did, without making a scene of it, without asking anybody's permission, told me something about you that your sisters never showed me in all their years of staying close. Renata wants credit for everything she touches. Denise wants to be told she did the right thing before she'll do it at all. You have never once asked anybody's permission for anything in your life, not even mine. And that is exactly the kind of stubbornness this work requires, because you will need to keep doing this quietly. And quiet does not come naturally to people who need to be seen doing good. I am not asking you to become me, Margaret. I would not wish that particular loneliness on anyone, not even on myself, if I had the choosing of it over again. I am only asking you to keep the ledgers going a while longer, to let a little of what's in that trunk find its way to people who need it more than you do, and to trust your own judgment about who and how much. The same way I had to trust mine with nobody standing over my shoulder to check my arithmetic. You will get some of it wrong. I got plenty of it wrong myself, more than these pages would ever admit to. Get it wrong anyway. A wrong choice made kindly does less harm in this world than a right one made from a safe distance. There is a man named Walt Pruitt who will have given you the key to the well house by the time you read this, and if he is still living and still willing, you would do well to trust him the way I trusted him, which is completely and without needing a reason why. There may be others who come asking questions once word gets around about what you found, people with softer voices than they deserve credit for, offering to take this burden off your hands for a price that will sound reasonable and will not be. You do not owe anyone an explanation for what you decide to do with any of it. You never did. I love this town more than I ever managed to say to a single person living in it, and I loved you more than I ever found a way to show. which I understand now was its own kind of failure on my part. One I am sorry for and cannot undo from wherever this finds me. Keep the greenhouse standing if you can. Keep something growing in it, even if it is only weeds for a season or two while you find your footing. And when you are ready, and not one day before you are ready, let somebody else in on the work, because I built this alone for longer than any person should, and I would not wish that particular solitude on you the way I lived it myself. With more love than I ever said out loud. Vera Coyle, October the 14th. Margaret sat with the pages flat under both palms for a long time after she finished reading, the kitchen silent except for the tick of the old clock over the stove. And somewhere out past the dark window, the greenhouse stood with its floor torn open and its door swinging free on a hinge Walt Pruitt had oiled without being asked. She did not cry, not exactly, though she pressed the back of one wrist hard against her eyes and sat there a while longer before folding the letter carefully along its original creases and setting it on the table beside the ledgers, where it would stay within reach for a long time to come. Word travels fast in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and it took less than 2 weeks for Renata to call, her voice bright in a way Margaret had learned long ago to be wary of. She said she'd heard from someone at the county clerk's office that Margaret had been asking about property records. And wasn't that interesting? And didn't Margaret think it might be time the three of them sat down together and talked things through like adults? Margaret didn't ask who the someone at the clerk's office was, because she already had a fair idea, and she agreed to the meeting mostly to see how much her sister actually knew and how much she was guessing. They met on a Tuesday afternoon at the shop, Renata and Denise arriving together in Renata's car, both of them dressed for a meeting that hadn't been called one, and Margaret let them into the front room past the dead calendar and the dusty register without offering coffee. Renata got to it quickly, the way she always did once she'd decided on a strategy, saying she understood there might be more to this property than anyone had realized at the reading, and that she and Denise felt, given everything, that a more equal division of the estate might be appropriate going forward. She used the word equitable twice, and Margaret noted without comment that neither sister had once used that word about the $61,000 or the $29,000 they'd already received without complaint. Denise didn't say much, which was Denise's way, but she watched Margaret with an attention that felt sharper than anything Margaret remembered from childhood, and when she did speak it was to name a figure. $90,000, she said, for a quitclaim on the greenhouse and whatever came with it, payable within 30 days, and in exchange they'd sign away any future claim and let the matter rest for good. It was on its surface a generous number for a building the will itself described as having back taxes owed against it. It was also, Margaret understood immediately, a small fraction of what that trunk alone had held, which meant her sisters knew more than they were saying, or suspected enough to be careful about overplaying their hand. Margaret said she'd think about it, which was not a yes and was not a no, and Renata's mouth tightened at the corner in a way that told Margaret the answer had registered as a refusal, regardless of the words used. Denise leaned forward then, voice still soft, and said that if Margaret didn't want to be reasonable about it, they'd have their attorney look into whether the provision about the greenhouse floor could be challenged as improperly drafted, given Vera's age and the state of her health toward the end. It was said gently, almost kindly, but Margaret recognized it for what it was, a threat wearing the clothes of a suggestion, low and calm, and dressed up as concern for their aunt's final wishes. The attorney's letter arrived 9 days later, on official letterhead from a firm 2 counties over, alleging that Vera Coyle may have lacked full testamentary capacity when the greenhouse provision was added to her will, and requesting a formal accounting of the property's contents pending review. Margaret read it twice at the kitchen table, in the same chair where she'd read Vera's letter, and then called Harold Pruitt, who listened without interrupting and said, once she'd finished, that he'd drafted that provision himself. in a meeting where Vera had been sharp enough to correct two of his own word choices before signing. He offered to write a response himself, at no charge, and said this kind of pressure rarely amounted to much. Once a lawyer on the other end realized there was a paper trail and a witness both ready to testify to it. It was during this same stretch of weeks, with the letter from the attorney sitting unanswered on the counter, that Margaret found a young man asleep in the doorway of the shed one cool morning, curled against the cold with a canvas duffel for a pillow and worn boots with the sole coming loose on one side. He startled awake when she came around the corner, apologizing before she'd said a word, saying his name was Cole Ashby and that he'd been passing through looking for day work, and that he hadn't meant any harm sleeping on the property, only that the shed had looked empty and the night had gone colder than he'd planned for. He had the careful, apologetic manner of someone used to being told to move along, and Margaret recognized something in it she couldn't immediately name. She didn't call anyone about him. She made coffee instead, and asked what kind of work he was used to doing, and he said carpentry mostly, some roofing, whatever paid, and that he'd been laid off from a construction crew 2 towns over when the job ran out of funding before it ran out of work. Margaret looked past him at the greenhouse, its floor still torn open, its roofline still sagging on the east side, and told him she had work if he wanted it, modest pay to start, and that there was a cot in the back room of the shop if he needed somewhere warmer than a shed floor. Cole looked at her for a long moment, like he was waiting for the offer to come with strings he hadn't heard yet, and when none came, he simply nodded once and said he'd start whenever she wanted. Over the following days, Margaret watched him work the way she imagined Vera might once have watched a stranger, to decide whether trust was warranted. And what she saw was a young man who didn't complain about the cold or the hours, who fixed the sagging gutter on the east side without being asked twice, and who ate whatever she put in front of him with the particular gratitude of someone who had gone without more often than he'd say out loud. She didn't tell him about the trunk, not yet, or the ledgers, or the letter folded on the kitchen table. But she found herself thinking, watching him carry lumber across the yard in the fading afternoon light, that this was very possibly how it had always started for Vera, too. One stranger given a place to sleep and a reason to stay, long before any of it had a name. The attorney's challenge fell apart faster than even Harold had predicted, and it fell apart in public, which nobody had planned, but which changed everything about how the following weeks unfolded. Harold's response letter had included a sworn statement from the notary who'd witnessed the will's signing, along with copies of 2 other documents Vera had handled that same year, business as sharp and precise as anything a much younger woman might have produced. The attorney representing Renata and Denise withdrew the challenge within 10 days, citing, in careful legal language, insufficient grounds. And word of the withdrawal moved through Larkspur Hollow the way word always moved there, faster than any of the people involved would have liked. What moved alongside it, though nobody could ever quite trace where it started, was a different kind of talk entirely. The kind that began with one person mentioning Vera Coyle's name at the diner counter and grew, over a handful of weeks, into something like a town slowly recognizing a face it had looked at every day without ever truly seeing. Carol Whitfield, who ran what remained of that same diner, told a customer one morning that she'd always wondered how she'd kept the place through her husband's illness, and the customer, an older man named Frank Delacroix, said his own mortgage had gotten paid down. Once in a year he could barely remember, quiet as anything. Right around the time Vera Coyle used to bring flowers to his wife's grave every October, without ever once staying to talk. Margaret hadn't set out to reveal any of it. She had simply, at Cole's gentle prompting one evening over supper, mentioned the ledgers to Walt Pruitt, who mentioned them in turn to a woman named Ruth Ann Meacham, who ran the Historical Society out of a single room above the post office. And from there, the story took on a life of its own, the way true stories about quiet decency sometimes do in towns small enough to still trade in them. By the time the county paper ran a short piece about the flower shop and its greenhouse, careful and understated at Margaret's insistence, half of Larkspur Hollow had already pieced together some version of the truth on their own, in kitchens and diner booths, over the kind of slow realization that comes from finally being handed the missing piece of a puzzle you didn't know you'd been looking at your whole life. Renata called only once more, in early spring, her voice quieter than Margaret had heard it in years, and said she'd heard what people were saying around town, and that she supposed she owed Margaret some kind of apology for the $90,000 offer, though she didn't quite manage to say the word apology outright. Margaret told her there was nothing owed, which was mostly true, and the two of them talked a while about nothing in particular, the kind of careful, ordinary conversation that doesn't fix a lifetime of distance, but leaves a door propped open where before there had only been a wall. Denise sent a card a few weeks after that, brief and plainly worded, saying she hoped the shop was coming along, and Margaret kept the card in the same kitchen drawer where she'd once found the county phone book, not because it mattered greatly, but because it seemed like the kind of small thing worth keeping. The shop reopened on the first Saturday in May, not as a flower shop exactly, though flowers were sold there again, but as something closer to what Vera had actually built underneath it all, a place where a person down on their luck could find honest work for a few weeks and a hot meal without anyone making a show of the kindness. Cole had stayed on through the winter, and by spring he'd taken over most of the carpentry himself, rebuilding the greenhouse floorboard by board with lumber Margaret paid for, out of the trunk. The same trunk that had funded over those months a roof repair for the Hendricks family and 2 months of grocery money for a young mother named Priya Kaur, who'd lost her job at the feed store, and a set of new tires for Walt Pruitt's truck, given over his objection and accepted only once Margaret told him plainly that some debts simply had to be allowed to run both directions. On a cool evening in late September, a little more than a year after the will had first been read in Harold's cramped office, Margaret found a second stranger asleep near the greenhouse, a woman this time, younger than Cole had been, with a backpack for a pillow and a coat too thin for the season already settling in. Margaret didn't hesitate the way she once might have. She woke the woman gently, introduced herself, and asked if she'd eaten. And within the hour there was a plate of food on the kitchen table and a cot made up in the back room, the same room Cole had slept in during his first cold weeks on the property. Cole, watching from the porch with a mug of coffee in hand, caught Margaret's eye and said nothing, but something passed between them anyway, an understanding neither one needed to put into words. That evening, once the woman had eaten and gone quiet with the particular exhaustion of someone who has finally stopped needing to watch her own back, Margaret walked out to the greenhouse alone, the way she often did now at the end of a day, and stood in the doorway looking at the new floorboards Cole had laid, pale and unweathered against the older wood around them, a scar the building would carry for years before it faded into the rest. The evening air smelled of turned soil and the first frost gathering somewhere out past the fence line, and a single moth circled the bare bulb hanging from the greenhouse rafter, its shadow sweeping slow across the rows of seedlings Cole had started in March, most of them grown now, green and stubborn against the coming cold. Somewhere behind her, in the house, a light came on in the kitchen window, warm and steady against the deepening blue of the yard, and Margaret stood a while longer in the greenhouse doorway, one hand resting on the frame Walt had oiled a year before, thinking about a woman who had spent 40 years teaching a town not to look too closely at her and had, in the end, been seen more clearly than anyone in her own family ever managed while she was alive. Kindness kept quiet long enough eventually finds its own way to the surface. She said it once, softly, to no one in particular, and then turned off the bulb and pulled the door shut behind her, leaving the greenhouse dark and settled for the night. The seedlings inside holding steady against the frost, waiting, the way all things in that building had always waited, for time enough to come up right.